In life, we often find ourselves at the crossroads of desire and obligation, where our deepest passions clash with the expectations of those we love. This tension can reveal our truest selves and, at times, expose our greatest vulnerabilities. The story I'm about to share is a testament to that struggle, exploring the complex dynamics of trust, loyalty, and the devastating impact of a single mistake. As we dive into the depths of this tumultuous journey, we'll witness how a seemingly innocent passion can spiral into a web of guilt and heartbreak, forcing us to confront the consequences of our choices and the intricate dance of human relationships. Join me as I recount the trials faced by Stacy and Steve, two individuals caught in a whirlwind of emotions, betrayal, and the quest for redemption. Through their story, we'll unravel the delicate threads that bind love and loyalty, ultimately revealing how the most passionate of dreams can sometimes lead us to the darkest of waters. Immerse yourself in the gripping tale of a seemingly perfect husband, a man who epitomized stability and loyalty until his life began to unravel due to a series of strange underwater events. Follow his journey as his once secure world crumbles around him, all stemming from a single mistake made by his wife. This story will compel you to reflect on the true value of trust, love, and loyalty. Have you ever wondered what drives people to betray their partners? It's baffling, isn't it? Sometimes it appears utterly ridiculous, leaving you questioning their motives. In the relentless pursuit of personal pleasure, individuals are often willing to dismantle not only their own lives but also those of innocent strangers who never asked to be involved in such chaos. To me, that's the most horrifying aspect of it all. The sun glinted off the warm waters, creating a mesmerizing display as the boat's bow sliced through the gentle waves. The temperature hovered around a comfortable 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sky was a brilliant blue, setting the perfect backdrop for a day of adventure. The steady hum of the boat's engine propelled us further from the shore, until the coastline faded from view. I leaned over the edge, mesmerized by the crystal-clear depths, hoping to catch a glimpse of vibrant fish darting beneath the surface. Suddenly, a gentle tug on my arm pulled me back into the boat's cozy interior. There, I found myself enveloped in the warm embrace of Stacy, the stunning woman by my side. She kissed me passionately, and when I instinctively tried to pull away, she playfully insisted, "You've got almost an hour to watch the fish while I'm underwater." "Are you embarrassed to kiss me in front of Bob?" she teased. "He already knows we're in love. Besides, we're married, we can do whatever we want." Stacy had always been the one to embrace public displays of affection, even from the very beginning of our relationship. It was her fervent nature that often led her to initiate kisses, unashamedly showcasing our bond, regardless of who was watching. She wanted the world to see the connection we shared, to understand that we were exclusively devoted to one another. Perhaps it stemmed from our small-town upbringing, where dating options were limited, or maybe it was just her strong sense of ownership. Who could say for certain? I had never struggled to find someone to date, but I certainly wasn't accustomed to having a parade of beautiful women vying for my attention. Stacy, on the other hand, possessed a subtle allure reminiscent of the girl next door, if that girl happened to live next to the Playboy mansion. With her long, thick brown hair cascading down her back and striking blue eyes that sparkled in the sun, she exuded a natural beauty. Her figure was just right, her breasts not overly large like a porn star's, yet certainly enough to turn heads. Everything about her was flawless, including the way she confidently strolled around in summer shorts, completely distracting me at times. It puzzled me to no end what she saw in me, considering I was as average as they come. Yet, for reasons beyond my understanding, she loved me fiercely. Despite the differences in our appearances, we were both in our late 20s, reveling in a wonderful life together. I worked as a design engineer for a prominent aftermarket auto parts company in Michigan, which afforded us a comfortable lifestyle. Stacy didn't have to work; instead, she devoted all her energy to creating a perfect home for us and the future children we envisioned together. Each year, we indulged in a couple of spontaneous vacations, often deciding on a whim to keep things exciting and prevent the monotony of everyday life. While we pretended to take turns choosing our activities, it often felt like Stacy had the final say. My interests were more conventional compared to her adventurous pursuits. I had a passion for cars that aligned perfectly with my job, designing aftermarket trim pieces and parts. This role not only suited me but also came with perks, like discounts and even freebies for my beloved Mustang. Unlike many of my acquaintances, I wasn't a collector. I typically kept a Mustang for 3 to 4 years before trading it in for a newer model. Currently, I was driving a midnight blue Shelby GTH, a car that initially came in black with gold stripes. Shortly after taking delivery, I had it repainted and upgraded. While my idea of a dream vacation might involve a trip to Las Vegas for the same show, Stacy preferred activities like skiing in Colorado or scuba diving in Florida. As we sailed through the glistening water, Stacy's grip on my hand tightened, her smile shining bright enough to rival the intensity of the Florida sun. Sitting beside Bob Markham, the boat's pilot, whom we'd known for about 11 months, we headed toward a coral reef known for its perfect diving conditions. We had met Bob during our scuba diving lessons. It was during that time that I discovered my inner ear disorder, which meant I could never dive. Although Stacy initially considered giving up diving too, I couldn't bear the thought of her sacrificing her passion for me. Bob appeared to be a decent guy, slightly older than us at 39, married to his childhood sweetheart. They lived about an hour's drive away from us in Michigan's Upper Peninsula and were raising 3 children together. Bob wasn't exactly a towering figure of handsome charm, he was just an ordinary man with a family, which gave me a sense of security about him diving with Stacy. Not that I harbored any doubts about her loyalty. She embodied the ideal life and had never given me any cause for suspicion. And trust me, I tend to be suspicious by nature. Stacy was affectionate, even-tempered, and always where she was expected to be. That sense of stability held significant importance for me. Growing up with a father who had gradually declined from a strong, charismatic figure to a shattered, disillusioned individual before his eventual demise had left its mark, I had witnessed firsthand how devastating life's pressures could be. As we navigated the waters that day, I couldn't help but ponder the fragility of happiness and the lurking shadows of betrayal that could threaten even the most solid of foundations. Yet, as we approached the reef, little did I know that my life was about to be turned upside down by a single mistake that would shatter my trust in the very person I loved most. What seemed like a perfect day, filled with sunshine and laughter, was merely the calm before the storm, and I was blissfully unaware of the turbulent waters that lay ahead. It was a typical Tuesday evening when I arrived at Angela's house for dinner with her 2 daughters, Brandy and Brenda. While they were undeniably cute, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were a bit too well-mannered for my liking. I've always believed that kids under 10 should be full of energy and noise, but instead, I felt like I was spending time with those picture-perfect children from a family sitcom. Angela herself was starting to resemble the kind of wife you'd find in a well-crafted fairy tale, perfect, almost too perfect. As our days passed, Angela and I began taking little walks together, though the girls were always with us. We explored parks, visited the zoo, and checked out various attractions that were just a day's drive away. The more time I spent with Angela and her daughters, the more comfortable they became around me. I could feel a growing fondness for them, and I found myself eagerly looking forward to every opportunity to see them. I can't pinpoint exactly when things changed, but about 4 months later, I found myself in bed with Angela. Replaying that night in my mind, one thing stood out: I hadn't done anything to initiate it. Angela took the lead, orchestrating the mood, the timing, and everything we did together. I wasn't complaining, though. For the first time, I experienced intimacy without any expectations attached. It may not have been wild, passionate sex, but it was genuine and filled with a sweetness that caught me off guard. From that night forward, our physical connection grew, and we began enjoying each other regularly. At least I was enjoying myself. Angela was a bit of an enigma. She had small breasts, which remained surprisingly lush even after giving birth to 2 children. Now, I'm not exactly an expert on the subject, but I had certain expectations based on what I had seen in films and magazines. Angela didn't shave like those women in adult films, but every time I caught a glimpse of her undressing, I was overwhelmed with excitement. My life had taken a turn I hadn't anticipated, yet there was a lingering sense that something wasn't quite right. To my surprise, Angela and I got married just 2 months later in a small, intimate ceremony. My mom flew in from Florida to meet Angela, my sister-in-law, who she certainly wasn't expecting to meet. I covered the cost of her ticket, and most of the guests were colleagues from work. Angela's mother, who lived in Mount Carmel, was unable to attend, and I realized I hadn't met any of Angela's family. In fact, she rarely mentioned them. Once we settled into our married life, we found a cozy little house to rent while I saved up for a down payment on our own home. I had always been careful with finances, and Angela no longer needed to work. She became a stay-at-home mom. Our sex life was consistent and enjoyable. However, there was one peculiar quirk: Angela insisted we always use a condom. Despite having what seemed like the perfect wife and 2 beautiful daughters, I felt as though I had stumbled into a bizarre alternate reality. After our first year of marriage, I thought life would settle down, but it didn't. Each day felt like a monotonous repeat of the last, and the longer this routine continued, the more paranoid I became. In the evenings, I often sat in silence, trying to decipher what was bothering me. The truth was, nothing was wrong. Angela was a wonderful wife, a caring mother, and an amazing partner. Yet I found myself questioning my own sanity, tangled up in thoughts that I couldn't seem to shake. Why was I feeling this way? Why was I sabotaging my own happiness? The best part of our wedding day was the time I spent with Brandy and Brenda. I could tell they enjoyed it just as much as I did. Being a logical person, I naturally wanted to analyze everything and draw conclusions. There was no reason for me to become an annoying, overbearing husband, but I felt I needed to start paying attention to the details of our lives. I made a mental list of questions that needed answering. Why had I never met anyone from Angela's family? What was she really doing during those frequent visits to her mother in Mount Carmel? And why was the girl's father such a mysterious figure in our lives? My first question to tackle was about the small locked folder I had spotted on a shelf in Angela's closet. The only time I had seen her with it was when she was enrolling the girls in school, and I had no idea where she kept the key. I decided that uncovering the contents of that locked box would be my first step. It felt like a logical puzzle, one I was determined to solve. On Tuesday mornings, Angela often went to a high-end salon called Elegant Chic. It was pricey, but I never saw the expenses reflected on our credit cards. I guessed she was paying in cash, yet she never seemed to have much cash on hand, and I hadn't noticed any unusual cash withdrawals. Since I didn't have any point of reference for how much a hair appointment should cost, it all seemed odd to me. One Tuesday morning, I pulled into the driveway and waited for her to leave for her appointment before heading into the house. Standing in front of the closet, I worried that she might somehow sense I was up to something. After a moment's contemplation, I brushed aside that thought. She was confident in her position in our home and likely believed her locked box would remain undisturbed. I was a good guy, after all, someone she could trust to respect her privacy. Carefully, I removed the box and examined the lock. It was a simple flat key with basic notches, and within 2 minutes, I had it open. Inside, I found a birth certificate, Angela's, along with our marriage certificate. There were also newspaper clippings and a few photographs, one of which showed her at her high school graduation. She looked just as beautiful then as she did now. The last items in the box were birth certificates for Brandy and Brenda. Both girls were born at Pottsville Hospital, but the most shocking discovery was the father's name. Anthony Ryder was listed as the father of both girls. Suddenly, the face of a familiar man popped into my mind. I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that accompanied this revelation. What was Angela hiding? What did I not know about the life she had led before me? My mind raced with questions, and I knew I had to dig deeper. Stacy's graduation picture hung proudly on the wall, a reminder of her accomplishments and the bond we shared. In that moment, everything felt perfect. As I prepared for our underwater adventure, Stacy embraced me tightly, pulling me close for one of her kisses that always left me breathless. She kissed me with a passion that hinted at the possibility of an uncertain future, as if she wanted me to remember her love in case anything happened during our dive. Her smile radiated warmth and affection as she donned her mask and gracefully descended into the turquoise depths of the ocean. Just before she submerged, she turned back and whispered, "I love you," her voice lingering in the salty air like a promise. Once she vanished from sight, I hurried to the bow of the boat and grabbed my iPad, which had been my source of entertainment during our journey. The connection had faded several miles offshore, but the device still offered a treasure trove of games and applications. Recently, I had installed a special app as part of a surprise for Stacy. Bringing joy to her face was paramount in my life. I often found myself reflecting on the complexities of relationships, even drawing parallels between my father's tumultuous marriage to my mother and my own situation with Stacy. The day was absolutely stunning, perfect for a boat outing, with warm temperatures and a refreshing ocean breeze. As I ventured into the galley, I grabbed a sandwich from the cooler, savoring the flavor of Canadian maple turkey breast while I tuned my iPad to the right frequency. With about 45 minutes until Stacy and our friend returned, a quick snack was in order. I took a sip of wild cherry Pepsi and settled into my thoughts, glancing at the iPad screen, when suddenly, a piece of sandwich lodged in my throat. Coughing violently, I leaned over the side of the boat, desperately trying to clear my airway. The sensation was reminiscent of what people described when recounting heart attacks. An overwhelming wave of panic washed over me. I could feel the pressure building in my chest as I fell to my knees, pounding my fist against my heart in a futile attempt to ease the pain. In the chaos, I accidentally knocked over a table on the deck, sending my soda and sandwich tray crashing to the floor. The captain rushed onto the deck, visibly alarmed at the sight of me clutching my chest. "Sir, lie down. I'll fetch the first aid kit." "We have a defibrillator on board," he urged, his concern genuine. "To hell with that," I snapped back, a surge of adrenaline fueling my determination. "Raise the damn anchors and take me back to shore now." "But sir, your wife and your friend," he started, glancing nervously toward the water. "Throw a dinghy overboard for them. They'll manage," I insisted, my heart racing as I focused solely on getting back to land. "The quicker we return, the better your bonus will be." Despite his hesitation, I had gauged his character accurately. For the right price, he would bend any rule. "How substantial a bonus are we talking about, sir?" he asked, a sly grin spreading across his face. "It hinges on your post-return actions, your discretion and ability to keep silent," I replied, a plan forming in my mind. "What do you say to $5,000? "I'll comply with anything you desire, sir. However, regarding the bonus, perhaps we could stop at an ATM for cash. Checks are cumbersome, and bank transactions can raise suspicion," he suggested, a knowing smile creeping onto his lips as he began hoisting the anchor. "Don't forget the dinghy," I reminded him, almost as an afterthought. He tossed a small package resembling a pillow overboard, and it splashed into the water. With a quick tug on a connected cable, he transformed it into a small rubber boat and secured it with a buoy. He swiftly started the engines, and we sped away without a backward glance. I hurriedly packed our belongings, shoving Stacy's things into the bags we had brought aboard. My heart raced so loudly I feared it might burst from my chest as I collapsed into a deck chair, pondering the uncertain future ahead. "Perhaps you should stroll around, sir, to maintain blood circulation until you receive medical attention. It's advisable to keep the heart active," he suggested from the wheelhouse, eyeing me intently. It seemed he suspected I had suffered a mild heart attack and was eager to reach shore, unaware that I was leaving my beloved wife and friend behind. Relying on either his return or someone else's rescue, I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. I was familiar with the protocols for handling heart attacks. They always emphasized seeking immediate medical attention and keeping the individual calm, quiet, and lying down. But it didn't matter in my case. I hadn't experienced a heart attack. What I faced was equally serious and life-altering, but more an emotional injury than a medical one. It took us about 90 minutes to reach the diving spot, with plans for a 2-hour stay before making the return trip. We should have been back around 6 p.m., but we had barely spent half an hour at the dive site and were making better time than expected on our way back. Carefully considering my next steps, I noted the captain's eagerness for the bonus as he expertly trimmed nearly 20 minutes off our return trip. Upon docking, he approached me, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "Shall I escort you to the nearest hospital, sir?" he inquired. "No, just to the nearest bank," I replied, leaving him perplexed but fixated on the word bank. "Now on to the second part of securing your bonus," I began. "I understand you want me to return to the area and swiftly retrieve your wife and friend. I just need to refuel, and I'll be on my way, provided you can manage to get to the hospital independently. I've arranged for someone else to pick them up." I was lying, of course. My task was solely to get to the bank for payment. After that, I needed to erase any memory of our encounter and the chartering of his boat. He appeared suspicious and opened his mouth to speak, but it seemed that money trumped any ethical concerns. He simply nodded, and we headed to a small bank in the marina. An hour later, I had checked out of the hotel and was waiting at the airport for my flight back to Michigan. As I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface, a storm of uncertainty that loomed ahead. As I scanned the horizon, my heart sank. There was no sign of our boat. In fact, the only vessel visible was a small rubber life raft bobbing about 50 yards away. Behind me, Stacy Martin emerged from the water, sputtering as she expelled seawater from her mouthpiece. Despite her drenched hair and cumbersome scuba gear, she somehow managed to look stunning. I couldn't help but feel a deep-seated animosity towards her. Everything about her, from her perky nose to her bubbly demeanor, her enticing figure to her firm butt, irritated me to no end. "Hey, Bob. Where's the boat?" she called out cheerfully, her voice dripping with the optimism that I found so annoying. Responding would only invite an argument, prolonging my interaction with her, so I opted for silence. Instead, I started swimming toward the raft, feeling fatigued and weighed down by the heavy tank strapped to my back. My mind raced with thoughts about where our boat could possibly be, replaying the events leading up to this moment in my head for what felt like the 100th time. Suddenly, I heard a noise. Stacy had activated her aqua scooter, propelling herself swiftly toward the life raft. I begrudgingly acknowledged her cleverness. I hadn't even considered that option. Grabbing my own scooter, I trailed after her, my irritation only growing. Upon reaching the raft, Stacy quickly discarded her tanks, letting them sink into the depths below. With careful precision, she maneuvered herself onto the raft and reclined. Following her lead, I also shrugged off my tanks, conscious of the survival situation we were in. My mind briefly flickered to the financial implications of those tanks, her husband's ability to cover the insurance penalties for their loss. Steve was a decent guy, I thought, as I settled onto the raft. Thankfully, the raft was spacious enough for 3 or 4 occupants, though not excessively roomy. I was relieved to find sufficient space to avoid any close proximity with Stacy, which would undoubtedly make me feel nauseous. As I began to assess our situation, I noticed the sun was still high in the sky. We had a couple of hours before nightfall, and while the warmth of the sun ensured we wouldn't freeze, staying on the raft until dark would likely bring an uncomfortable chill. Exploring the pockets inside the raft, I focused on the one nearest to me. "Bob, any idea where the boat is? What's going on?" Stacy inquired, her cheerful tone grating on my nerves. At that moment, I struggled to contain my frustration. How would I know where the boat was? I had been down there with her. Should I magically conjure a boat? I retorted sharply, my irritation bubbling to the surface. Let's take a moment to gather ourselves and figure out what's happening. Stacy simply shook her head, dismissing my suggestion. She began rifling through the pockets on her side of the raft while I did the same on mine. In total, there were 4 pockets, 2 contained a first aid kit and a flare gun, another held 3 small bottles of water along with some dried fruit and jerky, and the last pocket housed a small radio, more akin to a walkie-talkie. I held on to the hope that it could help us contact the boat for rescue. As I continued to grapple with our dire situation, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. This was our 3rd diving expedition together, and we had never surfaced far from the boat before, even while using scooters. This time, however, we had ventured farther out, and I was confident we had retraced our path accurately. The GPS homing feature on my watch indicated we were back at our original position, or at least very close to it. Considering our options, 2 conclusions emerged. First, something might have happened to the boat. However, if it had sunk, we would have noticed wreckage during our dive. Second, it was possible they had abandoned us, though that seemed improbable given Steve's devotion to his manipulative wife. He would go to great lengths to please her. Their departure couldn't have been voluntary. If they had indeed left us behind, it likely wasn't by choice. Perhaps they had been attacked, maybe by the modern-day pirates we had heard rumors about, or there might have been an emergency on board that necessitated their immediate return to shore. The fact that they left us the raft supported this theory. If they were under attack or being hijacked, they wouldn't have been able to spare the raft for us. I felt reasonably confident I had pieced together the situation, so now all I had to do was wait for them to return and send someone back for us. I estimated it would take 3 or 4 hours for help to arrive, and with no other options, waiting was our only course of action. As I glanced around, I noticed a bundle secured to the inflated edge of the raft. Upon untying it, I discovered it was a small blanket. Wrapping it around myself, I attempted to rest. The exertion of diving and the stress of our predicament had left me weary. "What are you doing? It'll be at least 3 hours before they can return for us," Stacy remarked sharply. "I'm exhausted, and there's nothing productive we can do in the meantime," I replied. "So I'm going to try to nap." "What's going on, Bob? Care to enlighten the rest of us?" She shot back, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "We're not in this together, and I have no desire to share anything with you," I replied curtly. "But from my perspective, they must have encountered some kind of problem or emergency while we were underwater, something urgent enough that they couldn't wait for us to surface to handle it, hence leaving us the raft." Given Steve's character and his attachment to Stacy, I wagered he would dispatch help for her promptly. It took us 90 minutes to reach this spot, albeit without rushing. Assuming they maintained a similar speed back, maybe even a bit slower if there was a mechanical issue, we were looking at a 3 or 4 hour wait. Like I said, I was exhausted. With that, I pulled the blanket back over me, hoping to drift back to sleep. Unfortunately, I made a mistake. It took nearly 24 hours before we were finally rescued. In a twist of fate, a charter boat from the same company stumbled upon us during their return journey. By that time, we were severely dehydrated, sunburned, and had nearly frozen to death during the night. Somewhere around midnight, I felt Stacy trying to roll over near me for warmth. My reaction was anything but gracious. "Get away from me," I yelled, my voice echoing across the water. "You have your own blanket, so use it." "Go to hell, jerk," she yelled back, her irritation matching my own. And just like that, our fragile alliance disintegrated further into hostility, leaving us both stranded in our own bitterness, waiting for rescue in the middle of the vast ocean. "I'm never diving with you again," I shouted, my voice carrying a mixture of anger and disbelief. I was relieved to hear her finally acknowledge the absurdity of the situation. "I'm glad you finally realized it, because they don't pay me enough to ever see you again," I shot back, feeling a surge of frustration. A few minutes later, I discovered she had drunk all the water we had left, clearly trying to even the score. Our food situation was grim, We had only 2 small packets containing bits of dried meat and fruit. As I polished off the last morsels, I felt foolish for devouring it all at once. When morning came, we were left with nothing to eat or drink. I sat there, brooding, trying to avoid looking at the woman who had stripped me of my dignity and self-respect. I despised her for it. What gnawed at me the most was her inability to grasp the depth of my feelings. I wasn't wealthy, exceptionally attractive, or particularly talented. Heck, I wasn't even the smartest guy in the room. I was just an average husband and father, utterly out of my league with someone like her. I often found myself wondering how her husband managed to win her heart. He seemed like an ordinary guy, just like me, yet she loved him fiercely, as if tomorrow might never come. Almost every word that escaped her lips was about him, and it sickened me. She simply didn't deserve him, no matter how stunning she was. Our day together was spent in a tense silence, punctuated by snappy remarks that barely masked our mutual resentment. Until the boat finally showed up, 2 thoughts consumed my mind as we drifted together in that lifeboat. First and foremost was my relentless hope of reuniting with my wife and children. I longed to express my love to them, to dedicate the rest of my days to showing them just how much they meant to me. This yearning eclipsed even the sensations of hunger, thirst, and sunburn that clawed at me. Coming in a close second was an overwhelming urge to grasp the woman's throat and squeeze tightly until all my anger and frustration drained away. The arrival of the boat not only saved her life but also spared me from acting on that dark impulse. Once aboard the vessel, Stacy and I quickly put as much distance between ourselves as possible, retreating to opposite ends of the boat. She made a beeline for the bow, while I headed toward the stern, mentally preparing for whatever awaited us on shore. She looked poised to leap off the moment we docked, eager to find Steve and figure out what was troubling him. The captain, who appeared equally bewildered by our situation, informed us of a shocking revelation. Contrary to our initial belief that the boat had been dispatched to rescue us, no one had even known we were missing. The captain of the chartered boat we had been on had returned early the previous day, apparently taking some time off after a successful gambling venture. He mentioned something about a passenger with a suspected heart condition whom he had hurried to shore for medical attention, but there had been no follow-up on that individual's condition. The focus seemed to rest solely on the captain's gambling triumph, rather than on the well-being of the passengers. I felt a pang of worry for Steve. I desperately hoped he had made it to a hospital capable of helping him. Deep down, I knew that only a crisis could sever his ties with that self-absorbed woman. It was a harsh reality. Even the most genuine individuals can become ensnared by someone utterly toxic. For Steve's sake, I began to fantasize about a swift end for Stacy. Perhaps she would accidentally fall overboard when we docked. Though it would surely pain him at first, he could eventually heal, preserving his essence and cherished memories. As for myself, I resolved to catch the first available flight back to my family, vowing never to leave them again. Standing at the bow of the boat, I had to confess that fear gripped me. The captain's incomprehensible words hinted at something being very wrong with my husband. Despite having gone without food for a day, a forbidding sensation churned in my stomach, signaling an impending shift in my life. "Please God, let him be safe," I silently pleaded, scanning the horizon for any sign of land. Even with the boat's brisk pace, time felt agonizingly slow. I felt as if I could swim faster than we were moving. The captain had lent me an oversized shirt and pants, leaving me still barefoot. I resolved to find shoes or sandals once we reached the hospital. The nightmare of the previous day began to fade, only to be replaced by a more harrowing reality. As anyone would attest, watching a loved one face a life-threatening ordeal is far more agonizing than experiencing it oneself. Despite Bob's unexpected transformation into a difficult person, my experience on the high seas hadn't been as terrible as it could have been. I couldn't understand why he chose to behave erratically despite our kindness, but dwelling on it felt futile. This marked the end of Bob's diving ventures with me. We had covered his hotel stay, airfare, diving gear, and more. not only this time but also on the previous 2 occasions, out of goodwill, believing he couldn't afford it. Admittedly, Steve's inability to dive with me played a role in my decisions. He insisted I shouldn't dive alone, however, finding another diving partner wouldn't have been a challenge, and I would do so in the future. Right now, my priority was Steve's well-being. My love for him eclipsed everything else, and I prayed fervently that his heart condition wasn't linked to our diving adventures or our time at sea. The mere thought of him suffering because of something I enjoyed was unbearable. Upon reaching the docks, I disembarked from the boat as soon as it came to a halt. I declined the charter company's offer of a doctor for our examination but allowed the physician to apply some soothing cream to my sunburns. I insisted on knowing which hospital Steve had been admitted to and was informed that there was only one hospital in the vicinity, so he must be there. As I stood on the dock, the weight of uncertainty settled heavily on my shoulders. The last 24 hours had tested my resolve, but now it was time to confront whatever lay ahead. It was suggested that I swing by my hotel to pick up some clothes before heading to the hospital. Given that the hospital was conveniently on my route, I agreed. When I arrived at the hotel, I was greeted by a series of unexpected surprises. As I approached the front desk, I noticed a woman who seemed vaguely familiar. Her smile hinted at recognition, but her expression was confused. "Are you returning so soon?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "No, I actually need another room key," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "My husband is hospitalized, and I need to gather some things to visit him." After a brief altercation, the manager reassured me that Steve had left the hotel the previous day and had been escorted to the airport for his flight home. Even though the manager's sympathy was apparent, the only help he could offer was a phone to call Steve. I tried reaching him on his cell, but it went straight to voicemail. With no other options, I contacted my parents, asking them to buy me a ticket back home. The hotel staff, showing their kindness, provided me with a pair of sandals from their gift shop and arranged for transportation to the airport. Considering our frequent stays and the significant amount of money we'd spent over the past 9 months, I was grateful for their assistance. As I waited at the airport for my flight, another surprise awaited me. After over an hour of anticipation, just as the boarding call was about to ring out, Bob suddenly appeared. I stood up, thinking that maybe his earlier strange behavior was simply a reaction to the stress and fear surrounding our situation. However, as I approached him, he stood up and moved further away, still aloof. Disregarding him, I turned my thoughts to more pressing matters. My father had clarified Steve's actions for me, and his reasoning made perfect sense. With Steve's heart condition, every moment was critical for his survival. Why would he risk his care at a lesser facility in a small Florida town when he had access to 2 of the world's top hospitals back home? He could choose between the renowned cardiac care center at the DMC or the stellar team at the University of Michigan Hospital. Hearing my dad's explanation hit me hard, making me realize 2 important things. He was likely correct, and Steve's condition was probably more serious than I had initially thought. Once we boarded the aircraft and took off, I struggled to relax. I peered out the window, feeling a familiar sensation akin to being on a boat. The pace of our flight felt agonizingly slow. I couldn't shake the absurd thought that I might reach our destination faster by flapping my arms. Upon landing, I scanned the crowd for my dad and eventually spotted him engaged in conversation with a vaguely familiar man holding a sign with my name on it. At first, I assumed he was there to escort me to the hospital to see Steve, but instead, he directed me to a conference room just outside the airline terminal. As I entered the room, a wave of recognition washed over me. I had been there before for meetings with clients from Steve's company. However, I was taken aback to see Bob the Jerk heading in the same direction. The room wasn't large, and we ended up seated at the same table, opting for a tense silence, pretending the other wasn't there. My father sat behind me, providing a comforting presence amidst the uncertainty. What came next was a petite, nerdy-looking woman who handed manila envelopes to both Bob and me, while my dad received a smaller card. "Stacy Martin, you have been served," she announced, her tone flat. "Served what?" I quipped, attempting to lighten the mood. "Lunch would be nice, I didn't eat much on the plane." The woman rolled her eyes, muttering something about stupidity as she walked away. I noticed Bob sitting across the table seemed distressed, glancing at me with what looked like murderous intent but staying silent. Then, he hung his head, and though I couldn't be certain, it sounded like he was quietly crying. My father opened his envelope and revealed the most beautifully crafted card I had ever seen. It appeared that Steve had personalized it just for him. Despite its somber tone, the message was heartwarming. Steve expressed his deep appreciation for the relationship he shared with my parents, portraying them as anchors of stability and family in his life. He treated them as more than just in-laws, he saw them as his own parents. This made me wonder if the situation was even more dire than I had initially imagined. Did Steve believe he was facing a terminal illness? Curiosity piqued, I peered into my envelope only to find it empty, filled with nothing but a stack of useless papers. Why didn't I receive a card? I pondered silently, confusion clouding my thoughts. My father glanced at the papers, then back at me, shaking his head. "What's going on with Steve, Dad?" I asked, my heart racing. "There's nothing wrong with Steve," my father responded calmly. "He's filing for divorce." "What?" I exclaimed, jumping to my feet just as the man who had accompanied my father at the airport entered the room. That was when I recognized him, the man who had coerced me into signing that agreement when I married Steve. I despised him for it. His subtle hints about the consequences of infidelity or divorce had nearly dissuaded us from getting married in the first place. "Stacy, Bob," he began, addressing us coolly. "I demand to speak with Steve right now." "I'm sure you're curious as to why you're here," the man continued, unfazed by my outburst. "At my client's instructions, we will now watch a brief video clip. This video will shed light on recent events. Afterward, each of you will have 10 minutes to present your explanations. Steve may choose to accept or reject your explanations individually or collectively. He may accept one and reject the other, or vice versa. He reserves the right to reject both or accept both. He will enter the room once the video starts, but neither of you was." His voice faded into a background hum as the weight of the situation crashed down on me. The gravity of what was unfolding became painfully clear, and I braced myself for the storm that was about to hit. It was suggested that I swing by my hotel to pick up some clothes before heading to the hospital. Given that the hospital was conveniently on my route, I agreed. When I arrived at the hotel, I was greeted by a series of unexpected surprises. As I approached the front desk, I noticed a woman who seemed vaguely familiar. Her smile hinted at recognition, but her expression was confused. "Are you returning so soon?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "No, I actually need another room key," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "My husband is hospitalized, and I need to gather some things to visit him." After a brief altercation, the manager reassured me that Steve had left the hotel the previous day and had been escorted to the airport for his flight home. Even though the manager's sympathy was apparent, the only help he could offer was a phone to call Steve. I tried reaching him on his cell, but it went straight to voicemail. With no other options, I contacted my parents, asking them to buy me a ticket back home. The hotel staff, showing their kindness, provided me with a pair of sandals from their gift shop and arranged for transportation to the airport. Considering our frequent stays and the significant amount of money we'd spent over the past 9 months, I was grateful for their assistance. As I waited at the airport for my flight, another surprise awaited me. After over an hour of anticipation, just as the boarding call was about to ring out, Bob suddenly appeared. I stood up, thinking that maybe his earlier strange behavior was simply a reaction to the stress and fear surrounding our situation. However, as I approached him, he stood up and moved further away, still aloof. Disregarding him, I turned my thoughts to more pressing matters. My father had clarified Steve's actions for me, and his reasoning made perfect sense. With Steve's heart condition, every moment was critical for his survival. Why would he risk his care at a lesser facility in a small Florida town when he had access to two of the world's top hospitals back home? He could choose between the renowned cardiac care center at the DMC or the stellar team at the University of Michigan Hospital. Hearing my dad's explanation hit me hard, making me realize two important things. He was likely correct, and Steve's condition was probably more serious than I had initially thought. Once we boarded the aircraft and took off, I struggled to relax. I peered out the window, feeling a familiar sensation akin to being on a boat. The pace of our flight felt agonizingly slow. I couldn't shake the absurd thought that I might reach our destination faster by flapping my arms. Upon landing, I scanned the crowd for my dad and eventually spotted him engaged in conversation with a vaguely familiar man holding a sign with my name on it. At first, I assumed he was there to escort me to the hospital to see Steve, but instead, he directed me to a conference room just outside the airline terminal. As I entered the room, a wave of recognition washed over me. I had been there before for meetings with clients from Steve's company. However, I was taken aback to see Bob the Jerk heading in the same direction. The room wasn't large, and we ended up seated at the same table, opting for a tense silence, pretending the other wasn't there. My father sat behind me, providing a comforting presence amidst the uncertainty. What came next was a petite, nerdy-looking woman who handed manila envelopes to both Bob and me, while my dad received a smaller card. "Stacy Martin, you have been served," she announced, her tone flat. "Served what?" I quipped, attempting to lighten the mood. "Lunch would be nice, I didn't eat much on the plane." The woman rolled her eyes, muttering something about stupidity as she walked away. I noticed Bob sitting across the table seemed distressed, glancing at me with what looked like murderous intent but staying silent. Then, he hung his head, and though I couldn't be certain, it sounded like he was quietly crying. My father opened his envelope and revealed the most beautifully crafted card I had ever seen. It appeared that Steve had personalized it just for him. Despite its somber tone, the message was heartwarming. Steve expressed his deep appreciation for the relationship he shared with my parents, portraying them as anchors of stability and family in his life. He treated them as more than just in-laws, he saw them as his own parents. This made me wonder if the situation was even more dire than I had initially imagined. Did Steve believe he was facing a terminal illness? Curiosity piqued, I peered into my envelope only to find it empty, filled with nothing but a stack of useless papers. Why didn't I receive a card? I pondered silently, confusion clouding my thoughts. My father glanced at the papers, then back at me, shaking his head. "What's going on with Steve, Dad?" I asked, my heart racing. "There's nothing wrong with Steve," my father responded calmly. "He's filing for divorce." "What?" I exclaimed, jumping to my feet just as the man who had accompanied my father at the airport entered the room. That was when I recognized him, the man who had coerced me into signing that agreement when I married Steve. I despised him for it. His subtle hints about the consequences of infidelity or divorce had nearly dissuaded us from getting married in the first place. "Stacy, Bob," he began, addressing us coolly. "I demand to speak with Steve right now." "I'm sure you're curious as to why you're here," the man continued, unfazed by my outburst. "At my client's instructions, we will now watch a brief video clip. This video will shed light on recent events. Afterward, each of you will have 10 minutes to present your explanations. Steve may choose to accept or reject your explanations individually or collectively. He may accept one and reject the other, or vice versa. He reserves the right to reject both or accept both. He will enter the room once the video starts, but neither of you was." His voice faded into a background hum as the weight of the situation crashed down on me. The gravity of what was unfolding became painfully clear, and I braced myself for the storm that was about to hit. It was suggested that I swing by my hotel to pick up some clothes before heading to the hospital. Given that the hospital was conveniently on my route, I agreed. When I arrived at the hotel, I was greeted by a series of unexpected surprises. As I approached the front desk, I noticed a woman who seemed vaguely familiar. Her smile hinted at recognition, but her expression was confused. "Are you returning so soon?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "No, I actually need another room key," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "My husband is hospitalized, and I need to gather some things to visit him." After a brief altercation, the manager reassured me that Steve had left the hotel the previous day and had been escorted to the airport for his flight home. Even though the manager's sympathy was apparent, the only help he could offer was a phone to call Steve. I tried reaching him on his cell, but it went straight to voicemail. With no other options, I contacted my parents, asking them to buy me a ticket back home. The hotel staff, showing their kindness, provided me with a pair of sandals from their gift shop and arranged for transportation to the airport. Considering our frequent stays and the significant amount of money we'd spent over the past 9 months, I was grateful for their assistance. As I waited at the airport for my flight, another surprise awaited me. After over an hour of anticipation, just as the boarding call was about to ring out, Bob suddenly appeared. I stood up, thinking that maybe his earlier strange behavior was simply a reaction to the stress and fear surrounding our situation. However, as I approached him, he stood up and moved further away, still aloof. Disregarding him, I turned my thoughts to more pressing matters. My father had clarified Steve's actions for me, and his reasoning made perfect sense. With Steve's heart condition, every moment was critical for his survival. Why would he risk his care at a lesser facility in a small Florida town when he had access to 2 of the world's top hospitals back home? He could choose between the renowned cardiac care center at the DMC or the stellar team at the University of Michigan Hospital. Hearing my dad's explanation hit me hard, making me realize 2 important things: he was likely correct, and Steve's condition was probably more serious than I had initially thought. Once we boarded the aircraft and took off, I struggled to relax. I peered out the window, feeling a familiar sensation akin to being on a boat. The pace of our flight felt agonizingly slow. I couldn't shake the absurd thought that I might reach our destination faster by flapping my arms. Upon landing, I scanned the crowd for my dad and eventually spotted him engaged in conversation with a vaguely familiar man holding a sign with my name on it. At first, I assumed he was there to escort me to the hospital to see Steve, but instead, he directed me to a conference room just outside the airline terminal. As I entered the room, a wave of recognition washed over me. I had been there before for meetings with clients from Steve's company. However, I was taken aback to see Bob the jerk heading in the same direction. The room wasn't large, and we ended up seated at the same table, opting for a tense silence, pretending the other wasn't there. My father sat behind me, providing a comforting presence amidst the uncertainty. What came next was a petite, nerdy-looking woman who handed manila envelopes to both Bob and me, while my dad received a smaller card. "Stacy Martin, you have been served," she announced, her tone flat. "Served what?" I quipped, attempting to lighten the mood. "Lunch would be nice, I didn't eat much on the plane." The woman rolled her eyes, muttering something about stupidity as she walked away. I noticed Bob sitting across the table seemed distressed, glancing at me with what looked like murderous intent but staying silent. Then, he hung his head, and though I couldn't be certain, it sounded like he was quietly crying. My father opened his envelope and revealed the most beautifully crafted card I had ever seen. It appeared that Steve had personalized it just for him. Despite its somber tone, the message was heartwarming. Steve expressed his deep appreciation for the relationship he shared with my parents, portraying them as anchors of stability and family in his life. He treated them as more than just in-laws, he saw them as his own parents. This made me wonder if the situation was even more dire than I had initially imagined. Did Steve believe he was facing a terminal illness? Curiosity piqued, I peered into my envelope only to find it empty, filled with nothing but a stack of useless papers. Why didn't I receive a card? I pondered silently, confusion clouding my thoughts. My father glanced at the papers, then back at me, shaking his head. "What's going on with Steve, Dad?" I asked, my heart racing. "There's nothing wrong with Steve," my father responded calmly. "He's filing for divorce." "What?" I exclaimed, jumping to my feet just as the man who had accompanied my father at the airport entered the room. That was when I recognized him, the man who had coerced me into signing that agreement when I married Steve. I despised him for it. His subtle hints about the consequences of infidelity or divorce had nearly dissuaded us from getting married in the first place. "Stacy, Bob," he began, addressing us coolly. "I demand to speak with Steve right now." "I'm sure you're curious as to why you're here," the man continued, unfazed by my outburst. "At my client's instructions, we will now watch a brief video clip. This video will shed light on recent events. Afterward, each of you will have 10 minutes to present your explanations. Steve may choose to accept or reject your explanations individually or collectively. He may accept one and reject the other, or vice versa. He reserves the right to reject both or accept both. He will enter the room once the video starts, but neither of you was." His voice faded into a background hum as the weight of the situation crashed down on me. The gravity of what was unfolding became painfully clear, and I braced myself for the storm that was about to hit. Here's a more detailed and engaging rewrite of your story, tailored for an American audience while keeping the character names intact. In the tense atmosphere of the room, we were all acutely aware of the rules set forth by the man at the front. No one was permitted to speak to or touch him in any way. Any attempt to do so would result in an automatic rejection of that party's explanation. "Is that understood?" he asked, his voice steady and commanding. Both Bob and I nodded in agreement, the weight of the situation settling heavily on our shoulders. "Any questions?" he inquired, scanning the room. Bob, reminiscent of a schoolchild eager to ask a question, raised his hand. The man acknowledged him with a slight nod, inviting Bob to voice his concern. "What are the consequences if he either accepts or rejects our explanation?" Bob asked, his voice shaky but determined. The man leaned forward, his expression serious. "If he accepts your explanation, you can return to your wife and kids, hopefully living happily ever after. If he doesn't, well, a duplicate of the file you're holding, along with the videotape, will be delivered to your wife before you arrive home." Despite his sunburn, Bob visibly paled at the thought. The room's lighting dimmed slightly, but not enough to hide the tension building among us. Suddenly, a flat screen behind the man flickered to life, displaying a video that made my stomach drop. There I was, along with Steve and Bob, seated at a table, raising our beer glasses in a toast. Then it shifted to footage of me and Steve sharing a kiss, a scene from our previous trip to Florida that now felt like a dagger to my heart. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but the video soon transitioned into more personal moments, home videos of me and Steve, interspersed with snippets of Bob's family at a cookout we had hosted. A surge of resentment welled up within me as I watched. I couldn't deny that Bob's kids were adorable, and it made me reflect on the idea of starting a family with Steve. But the video took a more intimate turn, transitioning to underwater footage that was eerily familiar. It depicted me gliding through the water on my aqua scooter. Damn, I looked good. The colors were vibrant, almost as if the videographer had been right there with us. "Who filmed this?" I blurted out, a mix of curiosity and dread flooding my mind. "It was Bob," came a voice I recognized as Steve's. He had an underwater camera attached to his aqua scooter. "I figured as we got older, we might want to show our kids or grandkids some of our past adventures." The video continued, showing me lowering my scooter and approaching Bob. When the scooter bobbed in the water, the camera angle shifted, capturing both of us as I took off Bob's respirator and kissed him. A suffocating silence fell over the room as I watched this betrayal unfold on screen. It was as if time stopped, and the oppressive feelings I'd been wrestling with all day surged to a breaking point. I had completely betrayed my husband, and the evidence was right there, playing for everyone to see. When the video finally concluded, the lights in the room brightened to their full intensity. As my eyes adjusted, I felt the weight of the various expressions directed at me. Bob's gaze was accusatory, as though I had wronged him. The lawyer wore a smug, self-satisfied smirk that made my skin crawl. My father appeared visibly shocked, but it was Steve's look that cut the deepest. The man I loved, the one I had envisioned spending my life with, regarded me as if I were insignificant, an object devoid of emotion or love. Before entering this room, I hadn't fully grasped what I stood to lose, Steve began, his voice steady but laced with hidden pain. You all probably think I'm being cold for how I've handled this, but nothing could be further from the truth. I'm in immense pain right now. The video I just witnessed shocked and wounded me so deeply, both physically and emotionally, that several people thought I was having a heart attack. Indeed, my heart has taken a serious blow, Stacy. And it's because of you. His words bore into me like arrows, and I felt tears welling up in my eyes. I believed our life together was wonderful. I loved you more deeply than I thought possible, especially given my past. I truly thought you felt the same way. But Stacy, you understand my family history better than anyone. My father, despite not being a fan of the Eagles, suffered from love. He devoted his life to a woman who was incapable of fidelity, despite being given numerous chances. She repeatedly betrayed him. As Steve continued, I found myself drawn into his words. I believe my mother loved him in her own flawed manner, but fidelity was beyond her reach. She tried, but cheaters inevitably repeat their actions. Each betrayal chipped away at my father until he was just a shell of himself, consumed by his capacity for love and forgiveness. Steve's voice held a glimmer of hope, as if perhaps, amidst this turmoil, he might grant me another chance. I am not my father, he declared, his tone firm. Unless one of you can provide compelling reasons otherwise, 2 marriages will end today. I refuse to endure what he did, not for anyone. Although I'm hurting now, I'll heal and move forward. Sooner or later, I'll find someone else. His words trailed off, and my thoughts spiraled out of control. This was suddenly grave. He couldn't simply replace me, I couldn't bear the thought of losing him. Surely, every marriage faces challenges. He wouldn't just discard what we shared for something so trivial, not even a fleeting affair. When I finally regained my composure, I struggled to catch my breath, but Steve continued, his tone chilling. The clock is ticking, he stated bluntly. Bob took a deep breath, preparing to speak. Firstly, I want to express my sincere apologies. I never intended to cause harm to you or anyone else. I've been tormented by guilt since this began. I didn't instigate it, and I had already decided to stop diving with you guys. I also assumed you were aware of the situation, or at least that's what Stacy led me to believe. As he spoke, I could see the sincerity in his eyes, but it did little to quell the anger bubbling inside me. However, on the boat, I noticed how you held her and gazed into her eyes. It hit me that someone who truly loves her wouldn't want to share her. Bob continued, his voice breaking. I don't have eloquent words or convincing arguments to justify my actions. Frankly, I'm not even convinced that you shouldn't inform my wife, although I'd prefer if you didn't. Perhaps you could allow me to tell her in my own way. Eventually, I will. The guilt will consume me until I do, but I hope to approach it in a manner that might give me a chance to salvage my family. He paused, drawing in a deep breath as though bracing himself for the weight of his own words. Steve, you're an exceptional individual, despite having financial setbacks. You deserve better than this. As the tension in the room hung thick, I realized how precarious our situation was. I needed to fight for what we had, to somehow bridge this chasm that had opened between us. My heart raced as I considered the enormity of the choices laid before us. The clock was indeed ticking, and I was running out of time. It means you remain authentic, just like me. You're not one of those pretentious people who pretend to fit into some mold. I genuinely admire the paths you've chosen in your career and often find myself wishing I had made similar decisions. I regret not pushing myself harder in school and missing out on opportunities that could have changed my life. Joining the dive class wasn't just about fulfilling a dream, it was a lifelong aspiration that financial constraints had always held me back from pursuing. The chance to dive was a collective gift from my wife, my family, and a few close friends who pooled their resources to give me a glimpse of that dream. Without their generosity, I wouldn't have been able to afford it, even though I work over 50 hours a week. That paycheck barely covers the mortgage and our basic needs. We lead a modest life, devoid of many luxuries, yet we find happiness in the simplicity of our everyday existence. Still, I carry an immense weight of guilt for not living up to the sacrifices they made to see me happy. I'm prepared to undergo any sort of examination, lie detector tests or anything else, to prove my honesty. I want to make it clear, I never pursued or approached your wife, and in fact, I tried my best to avoid her. Yet she made it apparent that she could easily find someone else to dive with, someone who would comply with her wishes. Perhaps the thrill of exploring the underwater world temporarily dulled my discomfort with compromising my values, but that guilt has been gnawing at me for quite some time. Before we even resurfaced from our last dive, I had already resolved to quit. That's why I acted so rudely towards Stacy after the dive and avoided her before it. I feel genuine shame and remorse for my behavior, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make amends, regardless of your decision. When Bob fell silent, leaning back in his chair, a heavy stillness enveloped the room once more. All eyes turned back to me. "Steve," I began, rising from my seat and moving toward him. I had hoped to embrace him, to reassure him that we could somehow work through this mess together. But a single glance from him stopped me in my tracks. "It's not what it seems," I started, though perhaps it was somewhat true. I wasn't thinking clearly. We all have our breaking points, those moments when our rationality slips away. For you, it's those darn Mustangs. How many times have we gone to car shows where you've completely lost it? Remember that blonde who was all over you at the event in Chicago? Or the Asian woman at the Nopi show? And don't forget the one with the orange and green Mustang at the Woodward Dream Cruise in Detroit. Each time, those experiences ramped you up so much that you ended up taking it out on me afterward. So yes, I have my breaking point too. There's something about being submerged, not just in a shower or a bath, but deep underwater, that drives me wild. I can't help but act on it. As I moved closer to him, I noticed he didn't pull away, indicating some level of understanding was sinking in. "I know you care for me, Steve, and I realize this situation has caused you pain, but you must understand that those moments were the only times I ever felt tempted to betray you. I can't explain it. Our sex life is amazing, even after all these years. I desire you every time I see you. Yet, being underwater ignites this intense arousal within me, and you can't be there with me during those dives. If it's what you want, I'll quit diving, but please remember this, just like your passion for car shows, each time I returned from a dive, we shared some of our most passionate moments. Just last night, like every other time, you struggled to stand afterward. I would have taken everything from you until there was nothing left. You're the only man I've ever loved and ever will love. This is just a quirk of mine, and I swear to you, I'll give up diving. This switch won't flip again. I understand it will take time for you to heal, but I truly believe we can move past this and find happiness again. Isn't our 10-year history worth one mistake? It's the only one I've ever made. I promise you've always done your best to make me happy, so please forgive me for this lapse. I know I've hurt you, but I wasn't in control. It won't happen again. If you truly love me as you say you do, as much as I love you, then please grant me another chance." For a moment, silence hung heavily in the air. I turned my gaze back to Steve, only to see a single tear streaming down his cheek. "Bob," he began, his voice strained, "perhaps we once considered ourselves friends, as you mentioned, but that can never be the case again. Whenever you cross my mind, all I'll see is you underwater with Stacy. There must be consequences for that. Yet, I could see he wasn't blind to the fact that my heart hadn't been in it. As the video showed, they say men can't be raped, but what I witnessed was painfully close to it. You can destroy the documents in the file, I won't pursue legal action, nor will I inform your wife. I'm not your judge, Bob. It's not my role to punish you or dictate your choices. However, I do have a suggestion for your penance: don't confess to your wife either. You mentioned that the burden of keeping it from her would weigh on you, so let it be. Revealing the truth would only cause her pain, and she doesn't deserve to feel what I'm feeling right now. They say the truth sets you free, but in this case, it would only relieve your guilt at her expense. Your punishment is to live with that guilt, knowing it's eating away at you. Thank you, Steve, Bob said quietly as he rose and slowly walked away. Steve then turned to me, gesturing for me to join him at the table by the screen. He took my hand and embraced me, followed by a long, passionate kiss. My body responded instantly, my nipples hardened, and my arousal heightened as he held me close. However, something felt off. As I ran my hand over Steve's pants, I noticed he wasn't becoming aroused. Stacy, you made some compelling points, he said, pulling back slightly. Before you spoke, I was so angry I was ready to just cut you a check according to our prenuptial agreement and walk away. But your words, both logical and emotional, struck a chord with me. When you mentioned that crazy switch we all have, you were spot on about many aspects of me. My passion for Mustangs, my excitement at car shows, you really hit the nail on the head. But what you missed was that even in those moments, it was you I wanted to share that passion with. Sure, there were other attractive women at those events, but you were the only one I desired. You're also right about how much I love you and how I always strive to make you happy. But, Stace, that's all I had to give. I couldn't give any more, no matter how hard I tried, and I suppose it just wasn't enough. As he spoke, he held my hand but then gently released it. You've chosen the wrong person to try this with, considering you know all about my parents and their troubled relationship. Some of the things you said sounded just like my mother, but I refuse to follow in my father's footsteps. I've seen firsthand that cheaters will always find a way, regardless of the circumstances or excuses. Unlike my dad, I won't sacrifice my self-respect for love. He kept giving my mom chances until he had none left. I loved you deeply, perhaps as much as he loved my mom, but our path can't mirror theirs. Initially, I planned to settle this with a check, but now I'm considering using the video evidence to challenge our prenuptial agreement and give you even less in court. I was stunned by Steve's words, tears welling up in my eyes while he remained stoic, preparing to leave. You once said my Mustangs were my Achilles heel, and for you, it's water. Well, I see you as some sort of H2O ho, and I can't stay married to you. I loved you, Stacy, but unlike my parents, I refuse to believe there's only one person for me. I'll find someone else. With that, Steve left the room, leaving me alone with my father, who remained seated, shaking his head in disbelief. A few months later, I found myself in court, settling for half of the agreed amount in our prenup. This meant I would have to look for a job, but in our small town, high-paying opportunities were scarce. I lost everything: the man I loved, my comfortable life, my home, and even the respect of my parents. The worst part was that I couldn't get back at Bob without risking my own reputation. Although I was tempted to tell his wife about the situation, I was warned that it could lead to an embarrassing video surfacing on the internet. Now, I had to endure watching every single woman in town compete for the love of the man I still adored. I single-handedly destroyed all my hopes and dreams of the life I envisioned beneath the waves. This story serves as a poignant reminder of how even the strongest relationships can be tested by difficulties and mistakes. It emphasizes the importance